Welcome back to Higher Exchanges, the #1 independent cannabis investing show, where we break down complex cannabis markets into clear insights you can actually use. Here are your hosts, Jesse Redmond and Morgan Paxhia.
Welcome back indeed. I'm Jesse Redmond, Chief Strategy and Investor Relations Officer at Leaf Brands. I am back again with one of the smartest cannabis investors I know. He's the grizzled veteran with a sunglasses tan that looks like it's from sailing. He's Morgan Paxhia. Morgan, what's up, man? How are you?
Doing just fine. Feeling some energy out there, which is great. And getting some SoCal sun when the May gray clouds break a bit. So,
are you feeling energy on the ocean, or are you feeling energy in the cannabis space?
A little bit of both.
Okay. I thought that was going to be your answer. I'm getting to know you better.
Yeah. How's it going up there? I hear you guys are getting some rain.
Yeah, not much, man. I was debating whether to water my tomato plants yesterday, and I decided to go ahead and water them. And as I look out the window, it looks like it may sprinkle a little bit, but not too much. No cannabis this year. I feel like I'm gone too much from my house these days to pull off a successful cannabis grow, but I do have some cherry tomatoes and some slicing tomatoes out in the garden that I'm getting excited about.
Nice. I got some lemons about ready to be picked, so I'm pretty excited about that.
Well, cool. Well, we are back with one of our favorite guests. For folks that may not know, and Hirsh, get ready, he has a law. Oh, I blew it. He has a law degree from Harvard, and it was head of government affairs at Airbnb. And in 2019, he pivoted to cannabis, and somehow he's still here. He is the incomparable Hirsh Jain. Hirsh, welcome back.
Thanks, guys. So great to be back with you.
You were laughing before we got started, and I did have a chance to ask you why. When we were playing the Higher Exchanges intro backstage to make sure I had things set up correctly, you started to laugh, and I forgot to ask you why, so I'm going to do it publicly.
Yeah, I was laughing because I was thinking about the evolution of this show over time. The increasing sophistication of this show, right? As someone who was, on back in the day before I think we were even on video and when we were on Spaces. And so now I see the mics and the music and different sounds. So that gave me a little chuckle. I'm not going to lie.
Growing up.
One sec, guys. I had a little audio snafu. We'll be right back.
Okay.
But I'm feeling the energy too, just like you, Morgan. So yeah.
That's good. Yeah. We'll get into it. Maybe while Jesse's sorting that out, I can jump in, and because another thing that we've added to higher exchanges is our sponsorship. We have a great sponsor with FlowHub. And I'm excited to talk about this week is they just last week had episode 4 of the Great American Dispensary Tour, which is a documentary series where CEO Kyle Sherman travels state by state to show what legal cannabis really looks like in America. In this episode, they head to Florida, home of the largest medical-only cannabis market in the country and a $2 billion industry that flies under the radar. Kyle gets his medical card on camera and goes behind the scenes with craft dispensaries to massive operations producing 30,000 joints a day. And yes, there are gators. Favorite quote of mine from the episode was, "No stop, no reverse, sounds like my life." And that was from Kyle Sherman. Check it out on their YouTube page. And while you're on YouTube, check out Higher Exchanges, click like and subscribe. We're growing that page as well. But I truly love that episode. I mean, if you look, it's getting a ton of views, but it's a lot of fun and, great overall series, but they really stepped it up a notch in that episode.
Yeah, that was a really good one. And sorry about that, guys. That's the danger of using Bluetooth headphones. I thought I was going to use some new Bluetooth headphones, but the audio got stolen by something else. So I apologize for my screw up there. But yeah, these have been awesome, Morgan. And that Florida one is one I really liked. Have you guys ever had gator bites before? Hirsh, I'm guessing being a vegetarian, eating alligator is probably not too high on your list. But how about you, Morgan? Ever eaten any gator?
Not yet, but how about you?
I've had the gator bites. I think it was in Tampa once when I was younger. And yeah, it was something you're supposed to get at a restaurant. And most people say it tastes like chicken. I thought it tasted like alligator.
Eating alligator is not on my list, but I did watch that episode yesterday, the FlowHub episode in Florida, and I thought it was great. The profile of sunburn the alligators mating. That was kind of crazy too. So Kyle does such a great job on it. And I really enjoyed it. So.
Well, I dropped out, Hirsh, when you're talking about higher exchanges too. And yeah, thank you for the kind words. I reflect on that sometimes, to think that this started as a spaces.
Yeah.
You know, originally we had 3 hosts and we got down to 2 hosts, and then we went to video, then we went to YouTube, and we're slowly inching up more and more on the production side. So man, it's been a journey. I think we're episode 98 today, Morgan. So just a couple away from 100 episodes.
Yeah, and we've got a special 100th episode. But we also, this week, hopefully, we'll have Apple Video cast. So, we just keep up in the game, baby.
Wow.
Yeah, they just started video podcasts on Apple. So we're optimistic when we upload this one. If you want to watch it in video, you can do that on Apple as well, which will be cool.
But congrats on 100 episodes almost. That's awesome, guys. Really, really great work. And I should say, I enjoy being on the show, but I learn a tremendous amount from all of the outstanding guests you have on that show. And I know I'm not the only one. So congrats and excellent work. Seriously.
Well, thank you very much. Let's jump right into it, boys. So much to talk about on rescheduling. And sometimes, I think Morgan especially, but both of us cringe around some of the political conversations because it feels like sometimes so much talk and so little action. But maybe we're rounding the corner here to some pretty meaningful stuff. So let's jump into it, Hirsh. And on the rescheduling side, we're going to get into the hearings. We're going to get into export. We're going to get into potential interstate opportunities. But let's start at the top and talk about how some different states are responding to the rescheduling order.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting to observe, exactly as you said, Jesse, how different states are responding to the order and what the differences, right, in those state level responses are. And I think the reason that there are differences is really, state regulators are facing a lack of guidance from the DEA, right? Like on the registration process. Like many of us, state regulators don't know, like, is completion of the registration process necessary in order to obtain 280E relief? We have this June 26th deadline for expedited review, but it's not clear what happens if you apply after that deadline. And so I think it's important to note that state regulators have the same questions that many of us have. And, I know that both from my private conversations with many state regulators, but also if you look at some of the press releases they've issued, whether it's California or Maryland or Nevada, these states have said, like, we will not get this information before the general public does. So we're responding to this in real time. And, I think it's also important to note those states, just like us, are waiting on guidance, from Treasury and the IRS about, whether 280E will be retroactive and, how, adult use and medical might be bifurcated for those purposes. And just the other thing to note is I think we're all still waiting on the non-retail portion of the portal to open up, right? We have this dispensary portal and, there's another form, as folks may know, called Form 225, through which non-retail licensees can complete the process. But, although the DEA told us those non-retail portals would be opening in the coming weeks, we haven't seen it yet. And so I think that's the context that we're all operating in, state regulators and licensees ourselves. Before we get to different state level responses, I think now more than 400 operators have completed the process. So the way that I think about that is like all of these operators, including some of the large publicly traded operators, are operating under uncertainty, and they think all things being equal, despite that uncertainty, completing the process is the best way for them to demonstrate compliance and obtain the benefits of rescheduling. And we can talk about what that is, but it's important to note, like, they don't know that for sure, right? That's just like the what they're doing with the information that they have. So in that context of ambiguity, I think we see different models about how states are responding. And so I'll give you one model. Like, on the one hand, there's a state like Oklahoma. So Oklahoma is actually the only state that has indicated that it's mandatory for its licensees to complete the DEA registration process, or else their state license will be at risk. So what Oklahoma has said is that, hey, licensees, you need to complete this process by January 1st of 2027, or you're subject to potential penalties or revocation of your license. Now, we don't really have a lot of detail about how that will work, but it is interesting that there is one regulator out there, at least one so far, that has said, look, you need to complete this process. It's mandatory from a state compliance perspective. And then you can contrast that with a state like California. And if you look at California, California has been very careful to say, we are not going to give you advice about whether you ought to complete this process or not. And you should consult with your legal counsel, right, about whether you should complete this process. And, having spoken to a number of different state regulators out there and flagged for them that Oklahoma is saying it's mandatory, a bunch of them are like, well, we're not there yet. And so I think that's one interesting thing. Some states are saying you need to do this or it's a compliance issue, and others are saying you could do this if you want. And then on that second model, as it pertains to California, I think what many of us know is that even though California is not endorsing or requiring its licensees to go through this process, they seem to recognize that the rescheduling order provides benefits to medical operators, and we can talk about what those are. And so what they're trying to do is to expedite or ease the process by which licensees can qualify as medical. And they're doing this in two different ways. One, it used to be a really time-intensive process for adult use operators to also obtain a medical designation. So what the DCC in California has done is through this form called Form 27, you can really easily, if you're an adult use operator, also identify as medical. So that's one thing. And then the second thing that the state of California is doing is they currently have issued some emergency regulations, and there's a few more days of public comment before those take effect. And those emergency regulations will expedite the process through which you can create a distinct entity and thus bifurcate your adult use and medical operations. And so my subjective commentary on this is like the state of California, like every other state, still doesn't know how this is going to unfold. And so what they're trying to do is to do what they can to enable their operators to qualify as medical so that those operators can obtain the benefits of being a medical operator. And I think it's great that they've done so despite that uncertainty. And maybe one or two more things I'll say, and then I'll pause as it pertains to the state perspective. I think we should note that California, in my opinion, maybe in all of our opinions, has the most to gain from approaching this rescheduling process intelligently. California is a huge potential market. It could be a $13 or $14 billion market. As we talked about, unfortunately, for years, right? It is operating at a fraction of that potential because of a surplus of product, because of the illicit market. And rescheduling, right, maybe over the medium term, right, could create outlets for California to truly reach its market potential, say via interstate commerce or export. So I think that's part of the logic here. California knows that it arguably has the most to gain, and its licensees arguably have the most to gain if this rescheduling process unfolds in a certain way. So I think that's part of the context here. And then the other thing I should say is it'll be interesting to see how other states copy one of these two models. So one example I'll give you is like Illinois is currently thinking through how it is going to interpret and approach rescheduling. And right now there's a bill that would considerably ease the process by which medical patients could obtain medical product. I mean, it's not exactly the same thing as what California is doing, but in light of this rescheduling order, Illinois seems to be saying, we want to make it easier for consumers to purchase via medical dispensaries by allowing every dispensary, not just a set of dispensaries, to sell medical product in Illinois and to do kind of other such things. And they've referenced California as an example. And so I guess I would just conclude by saying it will be interesting to observe in the coming weeks how different states fall into different camps or archetypes as they approach this order with limited information.
And why do you think Oklahoma is taking the route that they are?
I don't know. I don't really have a great answer there. So this is all speculative. I mean, I'll say the first thing, like Adria Berry, who's the head regulator in Oklahoma, is like the head of CANRA and is like a longtime regulator. So this isn't really an answer to your question, Jesse, but this is a very experienced regulator kind of like in that role. So I thought that was interesting that one of the leaders of the regulators is taking that stance. Maybe another hypothesis is like Oklahoma, after having opened in a very Wild West, like kind of anarchic fashion, has been very intentional about compliance and regulation. And so this might be another means through which they try to winnow down their large universe of medical licensees to those who can really come to the table and play. And so I think that culture of compliance has been embedded in Oklahoma for at least the past couple of years. And this might be just another example of that. And perhaps the only other thing I'll say is Oklahoma is obviously a medical only state. So perhaps they don't have to consider the complicated issues associated with having like dual licensees and how that might affect, different operators in Oklahoma.
What would some of the cons be for requiring like that Oklahoma model? I'm trying to think of the downside because I hadn't heard that. So this is interesting.
Yeah. And so folks can look it up. Again, the deadline that they've put out there is by January 1st, 2027, right? So longer than the deadline for expedited processing. I think one of the downsides and one of the reasons that maybe California is cautious, and I'm not breaking any new ground here, it's that the DEA application like asks a lot of intrusive questions, right? It asks whether you have ever been guilty of a federal crime or improperly handling like a Schedule I substance. It asks, you to disclose a lot of personal information for the people in your facility who are handling Schedule I product. So I think one downside might be that Oklahoma, and this is just theoretically speaking, right, might be subjecting its licensees to potential risk, right? Especially given that a lot of Oklahoma licensees have probably been coloring outside the lines, right? Shall we say, when it comes to their activity. So I think that could be one downside of requiring it.
I mean, there is the additional cost. And sorry, Jesse, this is really interesting. I do understand that, and the DEA is it's not free to register. Every store, every facility, there's a cost to it, so it's another tax we got to pay. I'm just stuck on the pros of it, and so that's why I'm just not wanting to be too close-minded, because it's like, to me, it's like this creates a very bright line between legal business and gray area or illicit, because either you are just legal or you're not, right? So, and I think California would actually benefit from that, because we do have so much, gray and illicit activity going on here, and it would be very clear, either you are DEA registered or you're not. And so that's why I'm just trying to think of like what would be, so other than this, subjecting employees, because that's a good point of like when you're doing state licensing, it's usually like board members and stuff that have to disclose personal information, but it stops there. It doesn't go, into the employees. But so it's interesting.
Totally. I think maybe one other thing to mention on this topic is California obviously has a big, history of legacy operators that probably have very negative experiences with the DEA. So again, not speaking for the DCC in California, one might imagine that they could be somewhat reluctant to require those operators to re-engage with a federal agency that had been prosecuting them for decades, and maybe they're a little more sensitive to that fact. So that could have played into the calculus as well.
Yeah, when I thought of Oklahoma and the requirement, Hirsh and Morgan, the first thing I thought was compliance, in that has been the Wild West out there. And I didn't know the vibes around Oklahoma. We don't do any business there. I haven't spent any time there on the cannabis side, so I didn't know if they were cool with it, or if they're trying to clean it up. But if you're trying to clean up and scare out the bad actors, and unfortunately probably kick out some good people too that maybe had some issues in their past, requiring DEA registration seems like, one firm step in that direction.
Totally.
Well, why don't we jump into the next thing, Hirsh, and talk a little bit about these adult use hearings. Today is Tuesday, May 28th, so we're just over a month away from those kicking off on June 29th. Talk to us, Hirsh, about what that process is and what our expectations should be.
Yeah, I mean, here's my take, right? So I think everybody knows the hearing starts on June 29th and it ends on July 15th, right? So it'll be over in 6-7 weeks or so. I think the very important thing we all need to remind ourselves of is that there is a legal challenge, right, to like this entire rescheduling process. And although we've seen one of those legal challenges be dismissed when it came to the Medicare CBD program, this rescheduling order, like all aspects of it, are still subject to a legal challenge. And so I think it comes as no surprise that, Sam filed a lawsuit, I think in early May, just a few days right after this rescheduling hit, challenging this legally. And without getting into all the legalese, one of the arguments that they made was that the rescheduling process violated a law called the Administrative Procedure Act, which requires you to go through like a notice and comment procedure for these kinds of regulations, right? So Sam filed a lawsuit. And then I think the other interesting and relevant development is that 3 states, right, filed a lawsuit after Sam. And those 3 states are Nebraska, Louisiana, and Indiana. First of all, it's kind of absurd. 2 of these 3 states have medical programs. So I think it's kind of ridiculous that they filed this challenge. I also want to remind people that 77% of Nebraskans voted to legalize medical cannabis, right, last November, even though that program is still being obstructed by politicians there. So it's particularly egregious that the Attorney General is wasting taxpayer money on something that his own citizens clearly support. So that's the first thing, right? They'll file a lawsuit. And so we'll see how all that unfolds. I think the second thing to pay attention to as it pertains to this process is who the list of participants are, right? I think that just will be an interesting thing for us to observe. And I imagine, a week from now, we'll start to get more clarity on who the witnesses are. People may have been following those organizations that have made public that they have filed a notice to participate. And so those are some of our allies, right? So like Normal, MPP, right, the Marijuana Policy Project, Attach, an organization led by Michael Bronstein, who I think folks know, and being represented by Shane Pennington, right, who I think a lot of folks know. So those are the folks who have filed a notice to participate. And then the most prominent opponent that has filed a notice to participate is Sam. So I think that's just the other thing for us to be watching in the coming weeks is who is actually admitted, right? Because I think that will give us a clue into what the discourse will be on the hearing. And look, in terms of how this all unfolds, obviously, I don't know, right? And this is just my educated opinion. I'll give you a few reasons why I am optimistic and hopeful that, in the weeks and months after this process concludes on July 15th, we might see a full rescheduling. Again, obviously, none of us know, but these are some of the things in my head. First, it's notable that there's an end date here, right? You might remember from our last ALJ hearing in front of Judge Mulrooney, there was no end date for the proceedings. Here, the proceedings begin on June 29th and end on July 15th. And in the middle, we got a long July 4th holiday, right? I don't know the exact number of hours this hearing will take place, but it's a pretty compressed timeline. So that makes me optimistic that this process won't go on interminably. So that's one thing. I think that the second thing is we've heard confidence being expressed by a lot of people who are closest to the process. So if I think about Boris Jordan, of Curaleaf, or Kim Rivers of Trulieve, they have expressed optimism that this process could wrap up in Q3, or they think for sure by the end of the year. Now, look, have those people been wrong before? Yes, right? Everyone in cannabis has been wrong before, so that's no guarantee of anything. But I think it's a relevant data point that some of the people that, at least in my opinion, have been closest to the Trump administration on this process, right, believe it'll be wrapped up expeditiously. And one could further, sort of conclude that, obviously Curaleaf did this reverse split right a few days ago, which will enable their stock price to remain above $4 for 90 days. And that would mean, if that's the case, that they might be able to uplist by October or so. And so, again, I'm sure Boris Jordan is speculating just like all of us, but it is interesting that they took that kind of preemptive step to prepare themselves for a world in which uplisting might be possible. And then a couple more things I'll say. I do think that there is merit to the argument that this is an argument that, Donald Trump and the Republican Party want to make in the midterm elections. Just a crude way of putting it is that his approval ratings, no matter your politics, are really in the tank, and he's going to be looking to play every card he can, right? In the same way that Joe Biden initiated the rescheduling process in October of 2022, a week before his kind of midterm election, right? As one potential argument, maybe this is an argument that Trump wants to make as well. So I think there's a relevant political consideration. And then the final thing I think, guys, is just I don't think this bifurcation is tenable over the long term, right? There are some people have said, look, what if only medical gets rescheduled? How should we prepare our operations? And look, I guess it's possible. We could be living in a world 2 years from now where only medical cannabis is rescheduled and adult use is not rescheduled. I guess that is possible. But that is just so untenable. First, conceptually, it makes no sense. I think we all in the industry understand how these categories are very malleable and aren't rigid. And even US senators, like Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, has said, well, how do you know if it's adult use or medical cannabis? So I think there's an intuitive understanding that this distinction doesn't make sense. And then one wonders, right? So if medical cannabis only gets rescheduled and then California allows everyone to become medical, right? What kind of happens then? Is the response to a medical only rescheduling states passing policies that enable their licensees to become medical designees to take advantage of these benefits? And that further illustrates kind of the incoherence of these two categories. So I could be wrong. I just can't imagine a world in which these categories continue to exist. And that's why I'm cautiously optimistic that we could see this get done later this year, but we'll see.
Sadly, I can.
Go on, Morgan.
Well, because politicians are, regardless, I mean, it's just adult use in a lot of their minds is a dirty word, but medical seems okay. So I could see them, so after July 15th, we're going to have this period of time where we're going to have to just see how these lawsuits come out. And, this is where the timeline gets a little murky again, right? Is there's just a lack of clarity of where adult use could be resolved, right? There's no follow-up date, right? After July 15th, right, Hirsh?
Yeah, there's no deadline. Yeah, that's true.
So if this drags on 6 months, a year, who knows? What's going to happen in the meantime? People that are already medical and are able to sell without 280E, they're going to be able to have different pricing capabilities. Markets are going to start moving in that direction. So if adult use doesn't get consolidated, if it doesn't all get consolidated, as it should, I totally get what you mean. It's nonsense, but it's just purely political in my mind. Market forces will shift. And then by the time they finally clean up adult use, it's just going to be like when medical first started and adult use came in, adult use took up 80% of the market share, and now it's going to just potentially be a reverse of it. And so by the time they actually come around to sorting it out, people are going to be like, well, what's the point? I mean, we're medical, we're already selling this. Like, maybe they'll still do it and maybe it'll balance out, but just so people don't have to pay for prescriptions or, whatever they need to do in their states. So I think it's more of a time function of whether, what adult use will ultimately look like. Obviously, if it gets done right away, then sure, both markets can coexist, but the longer it takes for adult use to get clarified, the smaller market share it's going to have, and then how meaningful is it really going to be?
Totally. And just to that point, Morgan, I can't really argue with what you said there. And I'll just quickly note, one argument in your favor is just history tells us, I hate to put it this way, but everything that can go wrong in cannabis goes wrong. Like any bounce that happened does not bounce our way. So if past is precedent, then that would support kind of what you're saying. And you can't argue with that. The only other point I'll make is that if that's the case, if we have a sustained period where only medical is rescheduled, not only is it incoherent for the reasons we discussed, we should acknowledge that that overwhelmingly benefits like the larger, more well-capitalized operators like the MSOs that have a medical footprint, and it disadvantages, social equity operators and newer operators that are adult use only. I'm not saying that'll be dispositive, but I imagine a lot of state regulators in different states, especially those that have given a lot of lip service to wanting to help smaller operators, will highlight like not only is this incoherent, but it disadvantages the smaller, less well-capitalized operators, which everyone, I think, would think is unjust.
Yeah, and this is where the 280E resolution comes into play, because those larger operators also have massive amounts of 280E that they've accumulated, and so that is kind of a equalizer. Is these newer entrants don't have all of that legacy debt. If those bigger groups have to pay for that, we'll have to see. But that does equalize it, where they don't have largely any, and then they become medical and they don't have any of those debts to deal with. So
totally.
Yeah, a couple thoughts here, gentlemen. First, I'd like to go back to someone that's so important in the cannabis movement, from the book Smoke Signals, Hirsh, which I know you and I both enjoyed. The Dennis Perone quote that every cannabis user is a medical patient, whether they know it or not. And so obviously at a fundamental level, this is so flawed. And that even think about the context of me in California, if I go grab an ounce of flower, call me a rec user, I split it with my dad. He is for sure a medical user. Is that medical cannabis or is it recreational cannabis? It's obviously a very flawed distinction up top. And so I say that philosophically, which is probably worth about nothing, but is sincerely how I feel. And number two is what happens, Hirsh, to states like California and New York in that context, where you have Michigan, there's a handful of meaningful medical markets, and most of those are just waiting on going rec, thinking that's going to be awesome. But if this framework were to happen, where this just gets delayed, what happens to these big states that have converted to 90-some% adult use?
Totally. I think that's exactly the question, right? And I think those states like California will try to find some creative means to situate their licensees within the medical bucket, and we'll see whether it's successful or not. But you're right, that I think that totally is the big question. Only other thing I'll say is you mentioned Dennis Perone, I think a really important historical figure who was crucial to the passage of Prop 215 in California in 1996. For those who don't know him, I recommend to everyone to watch the documentary that just came out called Join the Club, that features Dennis Perone. If you're ever a little depressed about spending your life in cannabis and whether you're doing something meaningful when comparing it to other things you might be able to do, watch that documentary. And I think that'll give you some historical perspective on not just what an incredible man he was, but how we are kind of following in his footsteps. So Join the Club, highly recommended.
If you were to grab your very foggy crystal ball and look through it, Hirsh, what do you think are reasonable expectations in terms of getting feedback on the hearings and knowing if it's going to be, a yes or no on adult use? Like, I hear a lot from MSO leaders about this being a third quarter event. I think some of the bigger analysts out there have written that as well. But what are your expectations of the timeline?
I mean, I will just go with, I'll just kind of copy what Kim Rivers and Boris Jordan has said, that it could happen in Q3. And then we think it's likely to happen by the end of the year. Again, acknowledging the merits and everything that Morgan said about potential delays. I guess that would be my rough expectation on timeline, for all the reasons that I kind of mentioned before, the midterm elections, et cetera. And I guess my signal would be if the hearings kind of go off without a hitch, right? I mean, just theoretically speaking, let's just say Sam doesn't get admitted, right? And, they aren't a witness there. I would take that as a positive sign. If there isn't something extremely disruptive that happens in the hearing. Now, is that foolproof? No, because a lot of this power lies within the Attorney General, right? So obviously that's just, maybe one kind of data point. But I think if these hearings proceed smoothly and without interruption and conclude on time, then that would increase my optimism a little bit.
So let's move. One more there, Morgan. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, yeah.
No,
One more for me. Yeah. On the state stuff, you were mentioning about like California, and something we've labored on to no end is the amount of municipalities that have not opted into adult use. But now that there's this DEA registration, are we seeing anything at the local level that is encouraging more municipalities of say like, hey, we can have a medical retail market now because there's this DEA process? Like if California has cities that have not had anything, pretending like it doesn't exist, but now all of a sudden can start doing this, like, are we seeing this pull more conservative local municipalities up and saying like, we can do this now? Are you seeing any movement?
Totally. We haven't seen movement yet, but I do think your train of thinking is exactly right, Morgan. And I do think if once this process like resolves itself and is codified, we will start to see that movement. One of the ironies, if you compare Prop 215, California's medical framework, versus Prop 64, right? Prop 215, the basic premise is that cannabis is medicine, right? And in that context, it was much easier to open up facilities in different jurisdictions kind of across the state. Prop 64 was premised on the idea of cannabis as vice, right? Like if it's a medicine, it's much more difficult to ban, right, people in your jurisdiction from conveniently accessing medicine. If it's a medicine, it's much more difficult to justify these really high tax rates. And so what I would say is the more that cannabis is framed as medicine, the more that we will be able to unwork this really unworkable framework, which is premised on the idea that cannabis is a vice. And that's reflected, right, both in the tax rates that are legal cannabis is subjected to, and also in these municipal bans. So have we seen anything yet, Morgan? No, we haven't, but I do think we will. And just to kind of undergird that with a little bit more substance, right? Like California recently passed a law that does not impinge upon local control, but which requires cities to make medical cannabis delivery available to qualified patients. Now, I know that's a really small universe, right? Making delivery available to the small universe of medical patients in California. But the implicit logic there, right, is that access to medicine is important, right? And so the more that this is reframed as medicine, I think the more that access will increase as a result.
And so when I put on my greedy investor hat, Hirsh, which I wear sometimes, I look at Schedule III, and I think about the 280E tax relief, which is, right, the biggest headline benefit that we're all excited about. With this DEA pathway, it opened up a couple other things that could be meaningful on the investor side, which is the potential for interstate and global commerce. So why don't we start, Hirsh, with interstate, and maybe you can frame up what's opening up here and how does this work?
Totally. Yeah, I'll give you my thoughts on interstate. Obviously, there are heated debates here. There's some people that think interstate are going to happen next month. There's some people that think it'll take 5 years. I don't think we have time to give a precise answer to that question on this show. But maybe I'll just lay out what are the relevant kind of legal, political, and legislative considerations that you should have in mind if you're trying to game this out. So, and a lot of these are things that folks have heard before, but just to kind of rehash them. So on the legal side, right? So the argument is that if medical cannabis, right, is now federally legal because it's Schedule III, then federally legal products are eligible to participate in interstate commerce, right? That's like the very simplified version of the legal argument, which says that the Dormant Commerce Clause prevents you from limiting this to in-state activity if it's federally legal. So that's a smart argument, and it's hard to argue with. So we have that legal argument that says, hey, if it's federally legal, interstate commerce should be okay. So fair enough. I think it's also important for us to consider the politics here, right? I think there are some states that will be very resistant to the idea of interstate commerce, and there are some that might be quite receptive, even receiver states, right? So I can imagine a world in which New York, for example, is not really thrilled, right, about allowing in a lot of California cannabis. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but they might not be thrilled. That might impact their pricing. It might hurt their domestic licensees. On the other hand, there are states that have no such program, and some of those states are legally required to set up a medical infrastructure following rescheduling. So South Carolina is a great example of a state that has no program, that has a statute on the books that says if cannabis is rescheduled, it needs to be made available medically, right, to the citizens of the state. Now, the Department of Health in South Carolina has basically said, yes, we've acknowledged that law, we're still interpreting it and understanding it. But I think the point there is like, there are at least 9 states in this country that lack any kind of medical cannabis program. And, one could make the argument that those states would be far more receptive than, say, an adult use state to interstate commerce. And so I think people who are trying to move towards a world of interstate commerce might tactically focus on those prohibition states because that might minimize some of the political friction. So look, there's that legal argument that I laid out before about why a court of law might say this should be able to happen. There's the politics we have to keep in mind. They will be tough in some places and they will be less tough in other places. So I think that's important. A few more things that I think are just important as we all kind of game this out here is there are, despite that legal argument that allows interstate commerce for federally legal goods, there are existing state laws that still prohibit this interstate commerce, right? So there are a bunch of laws on the books in states across this country, right, that do not allow this to be the case. And, without getting too nerdy here, if that's the case, we have to consider the legislative calendars in each of those states, right? We all know that Virginia's legislative session is over, essentially for the year, right? For example, Illinois' legislative session will end next week. Texas only meets every 2 years. So that's one important thing to note, that like if we're trying to change state laws, it doesn't matter if the governor is like, yeah, let's do it. You need to do it through a normal legislative process. And so that kind of begs the question of whether interstate commerce might unfold in an iterative way, right? By which we mean that it might start in some states before other states, and it may not be a kind of universal thing. So I think that's another concept to kind of keep in mind. I think as it pertains to California, right, since California is a very relevant state here, reminder to everyone that California has a law on the books called SB 1326, right, that authorizes the governor to develop interstate compacts with other states, right? And they can develop, the governor can develop those interstate compacts. One, if the federal government kind of like explicitly says that interstate commerce is allowed, or two, if the Attorney General of California deems that California would not be put at legal risk there. So I think that's a relevant part of the calculation. Is one of those two criteria triggered? And does that give California the comfort that it can engage in interstate commerce? Now, it'll still need to find a dance partner, right? It will still need to find another state. And this only allows the governor to negotiate a one-on-one agreement with another state. But I think that's important to keep in mind. And then a couple more, I could talk for a while, but maybe a couple more things and then I'll pause here. On the interstate commerce thing, again, without making this a legal seminar, right? Yes, the Dormant Commerce Clause prohibits you from creating these siloed state markets. But a lot of these questions are quite complicated legally, right? So just as an example, there was a proposition that passed in California called Prop 12 that pertained to pigs, right? It basically said like pork that is sold in California, must be raised under minimum confinement standards, right? So California adopting that law basically locked out a lot of other states from selling pork into California. And this was challenged right under the Dormant Commerce Clause. Like, are you obstructing commerce between the states because you're not letting folks who are, raising pigs in Montana sell into California because they don't meet your like health and welfare standards for animals? Think about, and I should note, like on a 5-4 decision, right? The United States Supreme Court said that was okay. Like that gives you a sense of how complicated this is. The United States Supreme Court said in a very narrow 5-4 decision, look, it is okay for California to impose these standards under health and safety and welfare reasons. So one might imagine, like, how might this apply to cannabis, right? Just imagine a world in which, California has certain pesticide standards, right, that are different from other states. And there is some justification that we ought not engage in commerce with other states because they don't have the pesticide standards we do. And again, I'm not saying that's what California would do. I'm just, saying this for the purpose of legal argument. And we all know California just spent a year revising its action limits for its pesticides. And so I think that's an example of how there could be regulations, on pesticides or labeling and packaging that function as a de facto ban on interstate commerce that kind of could get legally challenged. And so I would conclude all this by saying that I certainly think that rescheduling creates really meaningful momentum for interstate commerce. But if I were trying to game out a timeline here, these are the things that I would be thinking about: state legislative calendars, right? What the process is for forming these interstate agreements, and what the challenging mechanics of setting up that market might be from a pesticide and labeling and packaging and metric perspective. And I could be wrong, but my suspicion is that those challenges aren't going to be solved overnight. But we'll have to see.
So we often look to the alcohol industry as a potential model for how cannabis evolves. And if Google is correct, if you buy wine in Napa, you can ship that to 48 states. The only two states that you can't ship it to are Mississippi and Utah. Why do you think that is, Hirsch, that it's easy to ship wine, relatively easy to ship wine from California, but we're talking about being so difficult to talk people into bringing cannabis into their state from California?
I think my super simple answer here is that like alcohol is now a clearly recognized like federally legal product, right? And so it's treated as other products are, generally, and so that interstate commerce exists. And cannabis historically has been an illegal product, right? And so that's the reason, right? It hasn't been the beneficiary of this interstate commerce protections. And part of that is, I guess, the legacy of things like the Cole memo, for example, right? So when Colorado and Washington passed adult use in 2012, right, the Obama administration issued a Cole memo, which is like, all right, we will allow you to do your thing, but like keep it in state, right? And make sure it's properly regulated. And I think that just kind of got embedded into the legal architecture here. Now, I think that will clearly change at some point, but I think that's why maybe it won't change tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. And I was thinking too, Hirsch, maybe it's also because there aren't built out indoor wine grows across the country that they're trying to preserve as well. Like it seems like a lot of this is about self-preservation, right? Like on one side I see customer choice, the other side I see self-preservation. New York's an easy example. If you're in New York, is there a demand for California cannabis? 100%. Like maybe more than any other state, California cannabis is huge. So the consumer raises his hand, said, boy, I'd love to have that choice. I could support local, or I could buy, this other product, which you often see in the stores, right? In Santa Barbara, I could buy Santa Barbara strawberries, or I could buy maybe something imported from Honduras, depending on the time of year. So we're given that choice. But it seems like there's friction between consumer choice and self-preservation of those businesses that don't want to compete in that open market.
Totally. I think that's exactly right. And that's kind of what I was implying by the politics argument before, right? Imagine you're a senator in New York, right? And even if you're a very well-educated constitutional lawyer who understands the Dormant Commerce Clause, like you have a bunch of constituents whose jobs will be at risk, right? Arguably, potentially, if this interstate commerce is allowed. And so even if the courts are going to strike it down, maybe you put up a big fight, for your own electoral reasons, because the people of New York elect you, not people around the country. So I think you're totally right about the self-preservation. And I would say that those political dynamics, I don't think are enough to obstruct this in perpetuity, but maybe some of like the gum in the wheels or the gum in the ointment that obstructs this process, even if that's eventually overcome by things like court decisions.
And I think the obvious beneficiaries are the scaled California players. And I'd say this not just in a self-serving manner, but you have Glass House, on the flower side, that's probably the biggest producer of, flower in California. And they've obviously, built a business that would perform really well in export. Leaf, similar on the concentrate side, by the end of the year, we're going to be at 180 acres, which is about 7 million square feet of cultivation, have a massive extraction facility in Mendocino County, and we're able to meet, more demand across the U.S. So I think you look at businesses like Leaf and Glass House as potential obvious beneficiaries. But is there a second layer to this? I'd like to hear from both of you on it. But if you're Curaleaf, TerrAscend, you're any of the big players, and you have facilities in different states, and let's say you have 150,000 square feet in Pennsylvania, that's putting out fire flower. But in Maryland, you've got 40,000 square feet and you're struggling a little bit. Is this the pathway for the MSOs to streamline and move things across markets? Let me start with you, Hirsch, and then I'll go over to you, Morgan, and see if you see that as a benefit.
Yeah, my thoughts. I mean, first, I broadly agree with you, right, that the California operators are likely to be beneficiaries of this, both because many of them have the scale, right, to be very price competitive, and because there's a latent consumer demand for the product. I will say you hear countervailing arguments that like there are regional preferences when it exists to cannabis, and like people in Ohio, right, or otherwise have a deep cannabis culture and they respect local brands. I think that's true to some extent, but still like that can exist alongside a deep consumer desire for California brands. So I think both of those things can be true. And then on your question of like, are there other potential beneficiaries? I think yes, right? And you can think about this both in terms of operators or in terms of states, right? There are states out there that we all know, maybe Michigan being a great example, that are dealing with a huge kind of surplus of product, right? And so they arguably could be one of the beneficiaries here because interstate commerce gives them an outlet to dispose of that surplus of product in the same way it gave Canada, right, an outlet to dispose of its surplus of product when it came to Europe. And so I think there's a good argument that the California operators could be the biggest beneficiaries, but there are MSOs with scaled facilities, and there are, even non-MSOs that are operating in some of those oversupplied states that would probably welcome this because it expands their market. And I think in addition to the states I mentioned, Oregon is another great example, right? There are operators, for example, like a Grown Rogue, that is not what I think of as like a big MSO and is not a California operator, but also has a huge kind of outdoor facility that might benefit from interstate commerce and higher prices.
Well, one quick question before I answer was, Hirsh, when you're talking about the the federal test around interstate commerce, was you're saying federal legality, but rescheduling is not changing the legal status, correct?
I mean, you have people frame this in different ways. There are people who debate, like, does rescheduling like make medical cannabis federally legal? There's some people that say yes, and there are some people that say no, it's still on the Controlled Substance Act, and so it's still like illegal. So I think that's kind of a semantic question. Maybe I would say, like, it makes it like appreciably legal or much more legal from the first time, whereas on Schedule 1, it was definitely illegal. I know that's not a great answer to your question, but it's sort of like I think a semantic debate we have about, is this legal, right, or not?
Would it take an act of Congress to clarify that, or what would be needed so that it's not a semantic and it's like just clear?
Yeah, I mean, I think an act of Congress would help, for sure. I don't know if that's one we should expect. Yeah, right. But yeah, I mean, I think that would help for sure. And I guess the question is, like, we consider other Schedule 3 drugs. I think Tylenol is a Schedule 3 drug, if I'm not mistaken. Like, obviously, we consider that to be legal. So
With
I don't
codeine.
really have with
Tylenol with codeine.
With codeine. Got it. Yeah. So I don't know if I have a great answer to you on that subject. But I've just seen people have really different opinions on, is this legal or not?
Right. So, to answer your question, Jesse, I mean, I think we talked about this maybe like a year or so ago while we were in the purgatory of not knowing where we were going to be with rescheduling. I've kind of had this long thesis that obviously it's incredibly inefficient. This state-to-state, intrastate market system is just, it's not good capital allocation, but it's been forced. So companies have had to do this. They've had to build out all of duplicative infrastructure in multiple states. It's not smart, but it's what they had to do. So I'm not blaming them for doing it. It's just the challenges of this emerging industry. And, I thought an initial step would be interstate transport within a licensee. So if you're a Curaleaf or GTI, whatever, and to your point, like, you've got a scaled grow in a state, you don't need to go stand up another scaled grow in all these other states. You would be able to transfer products that you made in your licensed facility to your licensed retail in another state. And that way, but it's only contained within your ecosystem. So the manifest would be super easy. There would be total transparency. And I thought it would be a natural way for this industry to get some more scale without so much capital requirements that have been needed. But the overarching question, I think, around the interstate commerce is the competing forces around it. About where does the incentive lie? And Jesse, you hit on it, I think, pretty square on. Is when you think about when Prohibition unwound, it wasn't like we immediately had 48 states we were shipping wine to. It took decades to get there. Mm-hmm. And as Hirsh was saying, with these different legislative sessions and different political wins and all this stuff, how long could it take for some of these things? And I'm going to end it with a question back to Hirsh: is, do these have to be neighboring states to have these packs, or like, if you're sending product from California to New York, and are you going through Nebraska, or do they have to have legal states? Like, how does that all work?
Totally. I think that's a great question. But, like, for example, when it comes to SB 1326, the bill in California, it wasn't envisioned that those packs could only be formed with, Nevada and Arizona, right? And Oregon, right? California, under that law, if the federal government gives it permission, has the ability to develop a pact, with another state. And I think it was always envisioned that East Coast states might be a potential dancing partner. So no, I don't expect it to be limited to just neighboring states, but your question is a fair one, right? I think that's one of those things, along with tracking, right, and testing, that will need to be kind of worked out as commerce begins between these two different states.
Yeah, and I'm a little rusty on flower prices, but just to try to put some numbers around this, guys, on the concentrate world, because that's where I live. In California, distillate is about $1 a gram. Places like New Jersey, last time I checked, it was $7-8 a gram. And a lot of the country, it's in that $3-4-5 a gram range. So if you're someone, again, I'm just using my company's example because I know it best, like Leaf, who's used to selling distillate at $1 a gram, and all of a sudden you could even sell it for $2, right? Which is on the low end of where other states are. If we sold 25% of our output at twice the cost, our margins would go from 49% to 59%. So again, that's 25% at twice the price that you're selling it now. So that's real napkin mathy, but it does just show that for California operators, Leafs, Glass House of the world, I'm sure there's a bunch of others as well. When you start to change the math and get into some of these other markets, that's what a lot of these businesses were really built around. Like, Glass House, for sure, Leaf, that's been, on our radar this whole time. So it's really exciting to see that thesis getting pulled forward. Like you said, Morgan, we're talking about this a year ago. I started having some export conversations a couple of months ago, just kind of on a hunch around how this could play out. And here we are now, and those conversations are thankfully getting a lot more serious. And so I think it's a really exciting avenue. We talked about the interstate side, Hirsh, which I think most people think could take a little bit longer to play out. But there's another side to it too, which is leaving the country on the export side. So can you frame that opportunity a bit for us as well?
Totally. Yeah. So first, I agree that, it seems plausible to me that, export might happen in a meaningful way before interstate, in part because of the political resistance that we discussed before, right? That could be a real hindrance in the United States. So I agree with that. I think maybe the second thing to note is like export is an opportunity because we're seeing a pretty robust growth in medical cannabis programs, right? Kind of across the world. I know that's obvious, but just to enumerate them, and we don't have time to go through each example, but like Germany, right? Obviously like the most robust medical market in the world. Australia, a really robust medical market. UK, their market is growing. The Czech Republic, their market is growing. France's program is just getting off the ground. Poland, et cetera. So that's exciting, right? This is happening as a consequence of those medical programs being kind of stood up. And, what I would say is what is great about, cannabis being rescheduled or potentially being rescheduled is that like Schedule I drugs, there's a huge barrier to export right there. So, and this like makes it meaningfully easier. But then the other obvious thing to note is that, it won't simply be a free for all, that there are requirements to participate in that international supply chain. I think the ones that we've heard about, which obviously we don't have time to get into today, are things like GACP, right? And CGMP right here in the United States that are important for operators to kind of engage with. And I would say not all operators will be able to meet those standards. So I think that's quite important. And then we should also note that obviously there's EU GMP, which folks need to be educated on. And, the German regulator, as an example, keeps getting stricter and stricter in their application of those requirements. And so I think it's important to note that you're going to have to check a lot of boxes, and obtaining those certifications can take 6, 12, 18, 24 months. And so I don't think anyone should assume that it's kind of overnight. So I think that's relevant. And maybe two like kind of more political points I'll make is that I think one exciting thing is like you're starting to see Canada take notice of the fact that the US is rescheduling and is starting to get jealous about preserving its competitive advantage when it comes to international trade. I think that's what we want to see. We want to see what I would call a race to the top, right? Or a virtuous cycle where Canada's like, oh, we're kind of already playing this game, but the Americans might catch up to us. So let us ease our regulations to build this international supply chain. And then you need the United States to say, America first, baby, right? Like Canada is running away with this. We need to catch up with them. So I'm excited for that political dynamic to develop, even though I think, as much as I love America, I think we'll be playing catch up for a little while just because of the infrastructure and the certifications Canada has developed. Not forever, but I think for a little while. So I'm excited about that that competitive political dynamic to develop. And I think we should do everything we can to encourage it, to push these countries forward. And then the other kind of political point I'll make that isn't really an answer to your question, Jesse, but I think is important, is that the development of an international supply chain has a deeply legitimizing effect, right? Like we are all so frustrated at the lingering presence of cannabis stigma and how it is impeding our ability to build the cannabis economy that we know is possible in this country. The development of an international supply chain really destigmatizes cannabis, especially when you see other Western industrial democracies engaging in cannabis commerce. So I'm excited for that too, to kind of expunge some of that old legacy thinking on cannabis. And I think that'll have ripple effects.
Would we need EU GMP for exporting to Canada?
I don't know the exact answer to that question. I don't know. That is a good question.
Just thinking about Jesse's point on the pricing differential. It's been a while since I've looked at Canadian prices, but they're up because they have benefited from their ability to export to Europe. I'm wondering if there's a world where we could be exporting to Canada.
I think that'll be part of the conversation, both back and forth, right? I think Canada would want to export to us, and we would want to export to Canada.
Yeah, sure. We'll enter that agreement all day long.
Sure.
I'm sure Jesse would be very happy about that, right?
Yeah, Morgan. I had that conversation the other day with somebody, just kind of kicking it around like you were. Like, is there a path that we would run material from the U.S. through Canada, and then that would be the EU GMP station to move it abroad. So I think that's definitely something to be thinking about. Yeah, and I think when we talk about this again, the opportunity here is right now to sell things for a lot of operators on the West Coast, especially other low-cost states, at higher prices. And depending on the market, similar math to what I laid out in terms of Interstate, where 2, 3, 4, 5 times or more where we are in California, depending on which market. And these opportunities, guys, are very market specific. And Hirsh, I've been having a lot of these conversations with folks across the world. I know you've been attending the conferences, but man, it's just like learning all the states again, right? I mean, we've got 24 adult use states and I don't know, another 16 or whatever it is medical states. You've got to know all that stuff, which is already like running a multinational corporation. Now tack on, what's going on in Australia and Germany and Portugal and Spain, and even the UK is different. And man, there's a lot to unravel over there. But I think thesis wise, again, the opportunity to sell things at a higher price, which is awesome. But Morgan, we were talking backstage where we came on that this is still not a huge opportunity relative to like the scale of some markets in the US. Do you want to expand upon that a little bit, Morgan, kind of where we are in our evolution over there?
Yeah, I mean, we were just, the idea of should international export happen in the US? And my question is just around how big is the demand for international export relative to what we have within our own states. And just taking California's own market size, you can probably add up all of these international markets and still not even be the totality of California. So how much is it going to be incremental demand? How much cost is there going to be associated with being able to export internationally? So is there positive ROI there, even if prices are higher? Like, how much actual additional units will it help you do? Or it's just like this idea around the focus of a business and how material is it going to be, or is it going to be a distraction that's going to cost money and take away from your core business? And Hirsch told me is 1 million patients in Germany.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So really, in my mind, it's a competitive game where you're going to largely be competing against the Canadian export market. And do we have better quality? Do we have better pricing? What's going to give us a competitive advantage where we could take meaningful share that could add meaningfully? And I know I'm talking at a macro level. At the individual company level, it certainly can be material, right? For a company like Leaf, if you could all of a sudden be doing 100 million in export, that's obviously extremely important for your business. It might, for the state of California in total, like it doesn't look like that big of a number, but at the company level, it absolutely can be. So I was just trying to get like my arms around of like, what is the opportunity and how does it translate to at a company level to go through that process and the costs associated and how much attention is needed to do it. And does it just largely conform with what the DEA registration is going to be anyway? So it's kind of like a amortized cost against your existing business so that it is just truly an additive potential outlet. So this is kind of like my wandering thoughts around export. I'm still stuck on this Canada thing though, because I think this could be really interesting. The other one is Mexico, which, just give me a second here is, Mexico has been so stuck in proceeding forward with any kind of cannabis. And from my understanding it's a lot of fear around the cartels controlling it. Well, if they don't have any domestic supply of it, the only opportunity for them is to import it. And who better to partner with is their largest trading partner, the United States. They could still bring it in and they can do their finished goods and make it into products that they want for their domestic market. But we could be a supply source for them. And that could be fantastic. I mean, especially for us in California. I mean, we're like, this is just a natural thing. And so I'm just kind of hypothesizing. And I think that could actually, so some of these, maybe not the immediately definable international markets, but maybe some of these others that could become very meaningful by the time we're ready to actually do international export.
Totally.
Okay. No pushback on that, Hirsh?
No. I mean, I think those are all totally the right questions for sure. And the Mexico thing is certainly interesting. And we know how long it takes to stand up domestic cultivation. I think Germany is an example that imports a lot of product because of the time required to stand up domestic cultivation. So I think that's totally plausible. Like you said, the politics in Mexico are weird. It's been like 7 or 8 years now since the Supreme Court of Mexico deemed cannabis prohibition unconstitutional because it interferes with a right in their constitution called the right to the development of the personality. And so, I don't know, it's been 7 or 8 years, right? So hopefully they get moving soon.
And I think, Morgan, there's maybe been some misleading information I've seen on some of the social media channels about what is required, what is not required, and the costs associated with it. So it's real easy to look at this and say, oh, well, you need to spend X million to make your facility in the US a EU GMP facility. And I think that the premise and the costs are both incorrect in some of these occasions. Every situation is going to be different, but I've got a lot of hours under my belt in the last month or two learning about this, and I didn't want to give away information, that I've worked hard to find out myself, for free to everybody. But I will say, just from an investment and a process perspective, it looks like it's completely manageable, and might take something to the order for a leaf of something like 6 months to do the necessary SOP upgrades and all the other things you have to do to get the right certifications in place. There's a certain number of hours it would take you to get there. But in terms of ROI, it's a complete, in our case, no brainer. But if you have a different facility, different supply chain, it could be different. But on my side, that is not something that's giving us any pause. It's a lift. It's more time in some ways than capital. It's a bit of a lift, but there's a complete, the ROI is a no brainer. Well, guys, we're 1 hour and 3 minutes in, and we got to topic number 1, so I think we're doing great. Why don't we move things ahead, Morgan, and let's do a bit of a speed round and see if we can get out of here in the next 27 minutes or so, boys. And let's hit a couple of states for sure, and if we have time to get anything else, we will. But Morgan, why don't you kick us off? We talked about so much cool stuff with Schedule 3. On the state side, man, still slow movements. We want to hit 2 states, Virginia and Pennsylvania. And let me kick it off first with you, Morgan, on the Virginia side.
Yeah. So Virginia, had a new governor come in that was pro-cannabis, supposedly. Vote for me and we'll have legal cannabis. Gets in, and what is it? Very shortly after becoming governor, veto. Yet again. And it feels like a bit of a punch in the face. I'm going to just be honest, because it's like, this once again, a politician says, vote for me and I'm going to do this. And then they turn around and just, crush it. And, and I looked over the list of things. I don't have it in front of me, so I can't really regurgitate, but it didn't seem like it was that far off that it needed to be vetoed. But Hirsh, you probably have these all off the top of your head, exactly what happened. So what is happening in Virginia that they can't get it done? Why? And what I can't get out of my mind is the moniker that you hear from Trump of the do nothing Democrats. And I'm like, here it is again, as a Democrat comes into power and immediately stops progress from happening over what seemed like things that could have been resolved instead of just a hardline veto. Denying the people once again what they voted for, what they want. Like you said, this is not unique to, in that context, it's not unique to Democrats. You said, like in Nebraska, 77% of the population wanted it. We've seen it in Florida. DeSantis clearly, going against the will of the people. So it's not like that is bipartisan. It's like not acknowledging the will of the people, sadly. But what's going on in Virginia?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is it's really impossible to overstate how devastating what happened in Virginia is. Like, I would say this hurts more than Amendment 3 in Florida in 2024. And the reason I would say that is, first, we were on the 1 yard line, like we had this in the bag. That's why it's so devastating. But also, if you think about Virginia was such a limited medical market that the growth potential there was enormous, right? Like Virginia does less than $200 million in sales in its very limited medical market. by most estimates, it was going to be a $2 billion market, maybe higher because of all of the states that it bordered. So you could credibly say Virginia could have 10x'd. Now, Florida would have maybe 3x'd, maybe 2.5x'd, but you could say Virginia would have 3x'd. So that's why it's so devastating. And then also just regionally where Virginia is situated, like Virginia would have opened up both Appalachia and the Upper South. That's why it's so devastating, right? If Virginia would have gone online, then West Virginia would have been surrounded and Kentucky would have been surrounded. And then, all these southern states, you would have the first adult use state in the South, and then that would trickle into North Carolina. So we can unpack why it happened, but I think there's no way to overstate that like this was extremely devastating and really impeded the growth story. So that sucks. Second, I mean, it's hard for me to argue with you that this reinforces the perception of the do-nothing Democrats. And look, I see some of these debates on Twitter where people argue about who's better, the Republicans or the Democrats. And I guess just coincidentally, people's opinions seem to track their larger political opinions, which is sort of interesting. And people will say, hey, like there's 19 blue states that are adult use and there's only 4 red states. So like the Democrats are better. It's like, yeah, but like it was the voters in most of those 19 states that passed, those adult use initiatives. It was not the policymakers themselves, right? So I wouldn't give the Democratic politicians too much credit for that. And I would also say the few states that are red states, the Ohios, the Missouris, the Montanas, those are some of the best performing states in the country, right? And so, look, it's hard to argue with the idea that the Democrats totally screwed the pooch here. And the other thing is like if Virginia had gone the way it was supposed to, the Democrats would have had a really good argument in the sense that they could have said, look at the track record. Look back at Minnesota. We were trying to legalize weed in Minnesota for a long time, but the Republicans and one branch of government kind of impeded our ability to do so. And then we kicked them out, and then we passed an adult use law. And then look, we did the same thing in Virginia. And then they would have been able to go into Pennsylvania, right, and say, look, the same thing happened, right? There's one branch of the Republican government that's impeding adult use. Elect us, right? And then, which is like an argument that Josh Shapiro is making, and then we will pass adult use. So I would say that the Democrats did themselves a huge disservice. They would have been able to campaign on the argument that giving them control of government would unlock adult use, not only in Pennsylvania and also in places like Wisconsin, right? For example, or North Carolina, where there's a Democratic governor, but some Republican obstruction. Now, on Spanberger, I mean, I don't think there's any way to shade the truth here. Her arguments here are totally incoherent and deserve, I think, our complete scorn, right? So the first thing is she campaigned on this idea that, like, I'm a mom and I have 3 teenage kids and I understand the illicit market is bad and that a regulated market is better, right? She very explicitly leaned into the idea that an illicit market was bad for kids and that she as a mom would sort of advance a legal market for that reason. And then she just totally abandoned that thinking, right? And so I know we expect politicians to be dishonest, but this level of like dishonesty, I think, is particularly noteworthy. So that's number one. Number two, right? She said like, oh, I've talked to other governors and they've said that we shouldn't rush into this too fast. As has been widely reported, like she can't name the other governors that she talked to. I think we all know that it's hard to identify a governor out there who was like, oh, I'm really glad we waited, right? And created 3 or 4 or 5 years for an illicit market to kind of fill the vacuum here. So it's sort of like, when someone says something so crazy that they're lying to you, right? Like this is an example of that because there's no plausible way she would have talked to those other governors. And then even her arguments are incoherent. Like on the one hand, she said 350 dispensaries is too many, right? And which is crazy for a state of 9 million people, right? So like that's why I vetoed the bill. But on the other hand, she said, well, I don't think it's right that these well-capitalized actors should monopolize the market. And like, I want to give everyone a fair chance. So what is it, right? Do you want to limit the number of dispensaries and concentrate opportunity in a small number of actors, or do you want to broaden opportunity? So again, everything she's saying is so incoherent that it's very obvious she's lying. Now, why is she lying? I don't know. It's sort of like a mix between what I would call hemp talking points and Sam talking points, right? They're sort of like the hemp obstructionists who make this argument about delay that is supposedly about like equal opportunity, but really is a way for hemp to capture more of the market, right? And then there are these like Sam arguments that we should take it slow and like this has been rolled out and devastating. So I don't have any special insight into what's motivating her here. All I can say is like what she's saying is very objectively dishonest and seems to be an amalgamation of those two talking points. And the final thing I want to say is like, I don't think you should be able to call there are some like cannabis associations that are calling for, that have really been pushing her to delay. I don't think you can call yourself a cannabis advocate if you're trying to delay the moment where people will freely have access to this product. You're not a cannabis, advocate there. You're some sort of like an economic, right, or a social justice actor. You should not be able to label yourself as a cannabis advocate if you're trying to delay how long it'll take to obtain adult use. So that's the situation in Virginia, unfortunately, right? There's some discussion about, hey, maybe we'll fold it into the budget process this year. I'm not really that optimistic about that. I think there's talk about that. I would be thrilled if that's successful. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we'll take another shot at it next year. I think we have to resign ourselves to the fact that adult use sales in Virginia probably don't start until 2028. And look, everyone is pissed at her, so maybe this creates a fire, but I think we have to resign ourselves to that fact. And look, while I'm somewhat optimistic about what might happen on rescheduling, I think the challenging thing is both in Virginia and Pennsylvania, like you used to say, Jesse, right? Like state-led growth story with hard to time political catalysts. Now we have a better sense of the timing, perhaps, of the political catalyst, but the state-led growth story has evaporated. And that's because Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Florida, our big three, have not come online, right? And we're still years away from all three of those big three that we've been talking about for years. And then I would say the other big three have been half-hearted. And those I would label as New York, Minnesota, and Ohio, 3 states that have come online that we have good reason to be excited about. But all of them are still operating at half of their potential, even though it's been 5 years since New York legalized, and 3 years since Minnesota legalized, and 2.5 years since Ohio. So those six states explain why the state growth story has stalled. And look, there's some people that make the argument that the hemp ban will drive more demand to legal operators. And I think there's some truth there, but I am resigned to the fact that we're not going to see the level of growth we need to over the next couple of years. And that sucks, but that's the fact.
Well, yeah, I mean, like California's 2.5x off the market where it should be. Like, I mean, that's just, that alone is worth all those states, basically. Totally. So it's pathetic about how these politicians continue to, be a big problem. But with Virginia, I tend to agree that this budget reconciliation is just a carrot dangling to kind of seem like they still are trying to do something. But, it's like, we're going to pass safe banking in the special session at the end of the year kind of thing in years past. So, there was never going to happen, but I can say that now in hindsight that it was never going to happen. But at the time we all were hoping it was still going to happen. But in this case, I think it's kind of like that situation. The other challenge I saw, one of the things that really stood out for me with her though was one of the reasons she vetoed it was because she wanted to charge a much higher excise tax, and it's like once again. We are not learning. If she claims she's talking to these other governors, and I know to your point, like she's just been incoherent in her responses and like, totally waffling around, so there's no real sense of it. But it's like, if there's one thing that these governors should learn is that high excise tax does not actually penetrate the illicit market. If that's what we really care about doing, then you got to make sure that the playing field is level and so that businesses can have a fair shot at competition and, converting people that are easily accessing illicit product by doing so legally. And then I saw that and I'm like, she just doesn't care. Like clearly she doesn't care about a legal market. If this is her sense, she's not learning. She's not going out and talking to other governors of what's working, what's not working. She's just pushing whatever agenda that she probably knows will just kill it. Or, in her sense, she can just kill it. But it's just like, seems like to me is the Virginians sadly got hoodwinked and just elected the status quo.
Totally. It's devastating.
Yeah. So
it's a pretty concentrated landscape too in Virginia, if I recall correctly. Can you refresh us, Hirsh, on how the licensing works there?
Totally. It is a concentrated landscape. And I'm sympathetic to people who are like, dude, carving the state up into 5 regions is monopolistic, right? So I don't kind of dispute that at all, right? And there's good reasons to kind of critique that existing infrastructure. But in short, right, Virginia carved its state up into 5 health service areas, right? And so basically divided up the state into 5 regions, and people won licenses in each of those regions. And so the existing operators there are GTI, Jushi, and Verano, right? And then there are a couple of other operators, historic operators, Air and the Cannabis, that had obtained licenses there, but those licenses have since been taken over by Mill Street. So those are the 5 players in Virginia. Yeah, and I'll just say again, like if you want to see a more democratized marketplace, you can't say that and then say 350 stores are too many. Like if you want to open up opportunity, do it. Make it a more democratic market, but you can't say that and then say 350 stores are too many. That just doesn't square, right? So.
Yeah, that felt terrible, Hirsh, when you said 2028. I totally appreciate the honesty, but man, this was a market we were talking about back, it feels like in 2024. And it sure is disappointing to see that get kicked down the road that far.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, the Virginia legalized cannabis in 2021, guys. in 2021. They passed that when they legalized in 2021. And so that's one of the interesting arguments about waiting. It's like, why not wait 5 more years, guys? Like maybe we'll be ready then. Why not wait 10 more years? So we're all prepared for this opportunity. Come on.
Just one question before we move on to Pennsylvania is like, what is a person living in Virginia? Like, what's the lesson learned here? Like you know what I mean? Like, what's kind of the takeaway? Unfortunately, is like, politicians lie. Like, how do you know? Like, and most people are not single issue voters, but what's kind of the learning lesson from why we're still here?
I would say, we treat it as a fact that politicians lie, but we have an obligation as citizens to hold them accountable. And there are certain levels of dishonesty that are so egregious that we should kind of speak up about them. So, that's just, I know we kind of say that with resignation sometimes, but we should be angry about things like this. What is the lesson there? I mean, the one lesson is an indictment of the coherence and the organization of the Democratic Party, right? They had an overwhelming majority here and they weren't able to get this done. And it wasn't just on this issue. There was a host of other issues in which the Democratic legislature and the governor couldn't see eye to eye. It reminds me kind of that famous Will Rogers quote where he says, "I'm not a member of any organized political party. I'm a Democrat," right? So that's kind of the perhaps the lesson here. And so, look, what is your alternative? Are you going to vote for a Republican? No, right? Because they probably wouldn't have passed this bill. But I think Democratic voters have every right to be kind of to be angry here. So I don't know if that's a great lesson, but she didn't say what she was going to do that she campaigned on, and we should speak up about it.
Yeah. So recall Spamberger.
Well, the funny thing is Virginia governors only have 1 term. And so sometimes they don't care about pissing off other people. She will be termed out in 2020 or 2030 or whatever 4 years from now is, right? So, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about Pennsylvania, Hirsh. That's been another one that's been on our radar. And we were talking, you talked back around the Florida vote. We thought that fall, was that 24, right? When Florida was on the ballot. And we thought that fall we might get Florida and PA and potentially Virginia around the same time. Here we are with none of them. Let's focus on Pennsylvania, Hirsh. What in the heck is the holdup, man?
Yeah, the first thing about Pennsylvania is what continues to surprise me, and I don't have a good reason for this, and I'd love to hear anyone else's reason. Pennsylvania's sales continue to increase, even though its patient numbers are going down. So its patient numbers are kind of going down because it borders a bunch of states that have adult use, like Ohio now, and so I guess people don't register as patients. But in the first quarter, it did more than 450 million in sales in Pennsylvania, which was 6 or 7% higher than Q1 of last year. So that's one interesting thing. Pennsylvania's sales continue to increase for some reason. I mean, one way to think about it is Pennsylvania is doing pretty much the same sales as New York, even though Pennsylvania is a much smaller state than New York, and it, is medical. So just, it's a little bit smaller, but not that much. And so I guess the question is is there any hope of a bill passing in 2026? I don't think anyone thinks that, right? And, there one step that has been said that needs to happen before an adult use bill passes is a cannabis control board bill passing. The state seems to want to develop a new regulatory body before they're ready to move to adult use. And even that bill hasn't moved forward. So nothing is happening in 2026. Now, why hasn't it moved forward? I think the most simple explanation is that the Republican Party has blocked it right in Pennsylvania. And that's not really a political comment. The current woman running for governor of Pennsylvania, Stacey Garrity, said explicitly, if the Republicans have power, we will never pass adult use. The Senate Majority Leader of Pennsylvania, Joe Pittman, has said, we will not bring this vote to the floor. So the simplest explanation for why it hasn't moved forward, right, is that the Republican Party has blocked it. Now, look, is Josh Shapiro, despite being supportive, also using this as a talking point, right? Of course, right? There are no pure political intentions on either side, but I think that's the simplest explanation. And going back to Virginia, right? If Virginia had passed the way we said it would, then I think we could say with more confidence, look what happened in Minnesota. You get unified Democratic control, you finally pass a bill. Look what happened in Virginia. You have unified Democratic control. You finally pass a bill. And you could make that same argument in Pennsylvania. And again, without getting into politics, Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, in a pretty purple state, in a state that Donald Trump won, has almost a 65% approval rating. It's insane, right? Regardless of your politics, he is really, really popular in that state. And he's facing an opponent that he's probably going to crush this November. And if past is precedent, the incumbent party in the White House often loses seats. So, it is reasonably likely that, the Democrats could take the Senate in Pennsylvania, in these midterm elections. And so I guess if we're trying to be optimists here, the way that Pennsylvania gets unstuck is if Josh Shapiro and the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania have a really good midterm election, like win large majorities, and then he can do everything he wants the following year. The analogy I would make, guys, is like, if you remember when Ron DeSantis ran for re-election in 2022, he was like, dude, I really want to win a big re-election in 2022. So going into the presidential campaign, I have this track record of winning big in my re-election. And right after I win in 2022, I'm going to spend all my time in 2023 passing bills that my base wants. So when I run for president, like I can say all this good stuff that I've done. And so if you remember, that really strict abortion ban that DeSantis passed in Florida happened in 2023 because he won big in the election, and then he passed all the priorities of his base. And then obviously, if you remember, overturning that election ban became a feature of the Amendment 3 debate. That was Amendment 4. And so I use that analogy to say we can be most optimistic about Pennsylvania if the Democrats win complete control, right, of the government in Pennsylvania, which 6 months from now, we will know whether that's happened or not. One could say, well, like maybe they'll bungle it just like the Virginia Democrats did. I happen to think that Josh Shapiro is a much more competent political actor than Abigail Spanberger. So maybe the optimistic spin I'll put on this is we've been waiting for a long time. It sucks. But if the Democrats in Pennsylvania win complete control, and if Josh Shapiro in January of 2027 is like, how can I get as much stuff done over the next 8 months so that I can go campaign on it going into my presidential campaign? You could very easily see a world in which it happens. So hopefully that happens.
Morgan, remind me if you remember, or Hirsh, if you listen to these episodes and you remember, but I thought it was Jason Wild or Boris mentioned something around Pennsylvania being much more likely after Schedule III. Does that resonate? And do either of you remember that comment?
J-dubs.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think here's what I would say. I think that is definitely true. That is definitely true. Number one, S3 hasn't resolved itself yet, but like I think that is true. And I think that's a point that we've made generally about different states, that like Schedule III will help unlock Republican resistance in a bunch of different states, whether they be medical or adult use. I think that's true. I will also say, like, sometimes politicians just like say things, and you can't, I mean, to our prior conversation, you can't really take them at their word. So I have no doubt that there are a number of Republican politicians that have said, once this happens, we'll be able to move forward. But it's different, that it's different for them to say that and for it to actually be true. And then maybe a structural point is, no matter what every other Republican thinks in Pennsylvania, there is one person, Joe Pittman, the Senate Majority Leader, who decides whether to bring a bill to the floor or not, right? So like, we live in a system of government where like one or two people can be a gum in the ointment and can impede this from happening. And so I think those are the dynamics here.
Quick question on Pennsylvania. What do you know what the per capita consumption is at this point?
I don't know the per capita consumption, but the per capita sales have to be quite high because, again, it's like a $1.8 billion market and 13 million people. But I don't know the consumption. I would imagine it's high because, Pennsylvania, 50% of people in Pennsylvania live in what's called a border county, bordering another state where there is adult use. So cannabis is quite available legally in state or out of state.
Yeah. So to that point of like Virginia could 4x just if they had a more normalized medical access program. So like to your point, instead of a 10xing if we want adult use, they could still close a tremendous amount of that gap while we're sitting around waiting. Is there any talk in Virginia about expanding medical qualifications?
It's a great question. And we have seen in states before, sometimes when they fail to pass an adult use law, that creates momentum for an expansion of the medical program. Some examples of this are like Hawaii and New Hampshire, which, as you guys know, are small states but have been flirting with adult use for a long time. Adult use fails, and then there's kind of a compromise to expand medical. So that would be a really positive development, Morgan. I think you're totally right to say the medical program in Virginia has a ton of room to grow. Have I seen any real movement there? Not yet. And I guess the question would be like, does it need to happen legislatively, in which case we'd have to wait until next year? Or are there some administrative or regulatory things that you can do to just like ease the process of obtaining a card, for example? Or some state regulators have the power to expand qualifying conditions. And so I think that would be the question, is if they're able to do it administratively. Yeah,
because I mean, you look at Florida, when they didn't pass, then what happened? patient count started increasing. And now Florida looks like California did before Prop 64. You just go to a strip mall doctor and you get your card and you're good to go. It's like, it's basically, it is a light or heavily regulated adult use, but access is dramatically expanded. And so maybe we'll see that whiplash kind of effect in Virginia, which would still be great for people to get a much broader access. I don't know how that would work with all the licensing, as you were talking about, with how they have it all, segmented out, but it could still grow meaningfully in the meantime. Wouldn't ultimately get that big inflection down the road, but there still is opportunity in that state. I mean, to your point about Pennsylvania, I mean, it's taken years and years and still not there, but it's become a very large medical market. $1.8 billion market it's a good sized market.
Totally. It's huge, for sure.
It's a big market, Morgan, and it's a big MSO market too. And because of the investing focus of the show, I think it's important when we look at states to identify, like, does this move the needle in the public operators? Yeah, some states like Missouri, which is a great state, big success story, but not a big MSO state, but big on the private side. Pennsylvania is the opposite, or Pennsylvania is a huge state where almost every big MSO has planted flags in major ways. I could be off on these; they're a bit dated, but I have Trulieve with 19 doors, Cresco, Curaleaf, GTI, and Jushi with 18. So, guys, Jushi coming up in both of these conversations, right? Double-edged sword there. Lots of opportunity when these markets open, but sure is painful to wait. And Jushi might be the one that's most levered, to both of these states. TerrAscend just has 6 stores there, but they have 150 square feet of cultivation, which I believe is their second largest grow facility. I think they're a big player in the wholesale market there. And they Aaron Miles skipped over Verano with 17 doors. So, man, you pretty much just go down the who's of MSOs, and they have big operations in Pennsylvania. So, kind of reflecting, guys, as we get towards wrapping the show here, it feels like we're in a bit of a different spot, Hirsh, which I think you highlighted, which is that for a while we were doing well on the growth side. We had this set of dominoes that we expected to fall, and I was thinking about exactly what you brought up, Hirsh. I kept saying it's a state-led growth story with a series of hard-to-time catalysts. That's still the thesis, but at some times you're going to be feeling one side more than the other, and I feel like for a long time the growth path was a little bit more clear. Now, between new states, Florida, Pennsylvania, Virginia in particular, taking more time, and the intoxicating hemp market eating into it, we're in a spot where we're at flatline growth, specifically for the bigger, more diversified companies. If you're in fewer states, it's going to be quite different. If you're just California or just Florida, you might have a little bit different trajectory. But for these big MSOs that are largely levered to the state-led growth story, we're on a bit of a pause here on that side. Maybe the intoxicating hemp market, brings some of those dollars back in. But then the flip side is we're seeing these new opportunities on the federal side, new opportunities around Schedule III with the obvious 280E removal. Awesome to see that going forward. Seeing marginal more interest in investors, having better conversations. With Leaf, we've been raising some capital. Man, we've been bringing in much better investors, great family offices. Some of my favorites are people that are, portfolio managers at big funds, but invest their personal capital with you. I think those tend to be great investors. So starting to bring more people over the wall on the rescheduling side. I think there's good progress there. Add in the export and the interstate. I think that side suddenly is pretty exciting, but unfortunately it's hard to put those two pieces together to marry the state-led growth story with the political catalysts. And I think on the show here, we don't want to be just blindly optimistic and just painting a rosy picture because that's what we think people want to hear. I think it's good to be honest about where we are. And I think there's a lot of positives going on, but I think you have to look at the state-led growth story and feel like I don't think it's necessarily a stumbling block. It's just a pause. And maybe this means down the road, there's got to be a year. Maybe it's 28. I don't know what it is, where 3 or 4 or 5 big states suddenly fall, but it looks like it's going to be dry here for a little bit in the meantime.
I think, unfortunately, that's correct. Yeah.
Morgan, any closing thoughts before I say thanks to FlowHub and get us out of here?
No, I mean, this has been great, Hirsh. Really appreciate this conversation. So this has been a good update for me. Just kind of hearing, because I haven't been staying as close to all this rescheduling stuff. I've just been trying to patiently wait for the hearings and see how things go. So I appreciate sharing all your insights with us over the last hour and a half.
Totally. It was awesome, guys. Thank you.
And thank you again to FlowHub for making today's show possible. Whether you are a big MSO with 100 dispensaries, or you're a simple guy like me and you just had one store, you need the best software to win. Make your life easier and make your store more profitable. Go to flowhub.com and book a demo today. So thanks, Kyle, the whole team for supporting Higher Exchanges. They're awesome guys to work with, and love that they have a great product as well. So thank you again to FlowHub. Hirsh, thank you for your time coming back. Thank you for all the offline conversations that we have. You're one of the bright lights, bright stars, most articulate, but also just overall a good human being in the space. So lucky to have you, and thank you for always coming back on Higher Exchanges.
Thanks, guys.
Morgan, always good to talk to you, my friend. We'll see you guys back here in a couple of weeks. Go over to YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe there, and also on Apple Podcasts. If you're a video person, check that out. Hopefully that's working as well. And I'll end it with a read. The views expressed in this podcast are provided for informational purposes only. Nothing we said should be considered research nor a recommendation. All investing involves risk, including the loss of principal.